The rain came down on the Ravensmere Road the way it always did in November, thin and cold and without mercy, and the black coach that stopped at the Bell and Anchor carried a man who had not smiled in 10 years. The ostlers knew the coach before they knew the man. Everyone in the county knew it. The black lacquer, the black horses, the crest with its raven, picked out in silver, that had gone the color of old pewter from the weather, and inside it, always in mourning, the Earl of Ravensmere. He had worn black for a decade. He had worn it so long, the county had stopped remarking on it and begun to treat it as a fact of the landscape, like the gray stone of the church or the bare limbs of the beeches. Along the drive, he came inside out of the wet, and the low common room of the inn drew back from him, without meaning to, the way a room draws back from grief it does not know how to address. He asked for a private parlor and a fire and something hot, and the landlord bowed and hurried, and the Earl sat by the window with his gloves still on, and watched the rain streak the glass. He did not expect anything of that night. That was the thing to understand about him. He had stopped expecting. You will meet a woman tonight the world buried 10 years ago. Stay with me, and watch how a man who has grieved a name learns that the name was never in the grave at all. In the kitchen, behind the common room, a woman was drawing a tray of bread from the oven, and her hands, wrapped in a cloth gone brown at the edges, were sure and quick and raw at the knuckles from 10 winters of work. The other girls called her Nell. She had been Nell to them for as long as they had known her, which was 6 years, since she had come up the road one autumn with nothing but a bundle and a way of speaking that did not match her apron. She did not tell them where she had come from. She did not tell anyone. She had learned that the first rule of surviving a thing was to stop naming it, and she had named nothing for 10 years. She heard the coach and did not look up. Tow coaches came. Grand ones came less often to the Bell and Anchor than to the posting house at the crossroads. But they came, and she had long since stopped lifting her head at the sound of wealth arriving. She set the bread to cool, and turned the joint on the spit, and wiped her hands. And when the landlord's wife put her head through the door, and said the gentleman in the parlor wanted the good stew, and not the common one, and to carry it herself, and mind her curtsy, Nell only nodded and reached for the bowl. She did not know the coach. She could not have known it. She had never in her life seen the Ravensmere black, because when she had been Eleanor, she had been the daughter of a country attorney with a good name and no fortune, and the man she had married in a village church with 6 people watching had not yet come into the title. His uncle had held it then. He had been only Marcus Vane, and she had been Eleanor Vane, and they had had 4 months together before the sea took her, or was said to have taken her, off the Devon coast, where his aunt had sent them for the air. The stew steamed in the bowl. She carried it down the passage. She pushed the parlor door with her shoulder because her hands were full, and she came into the warm and the firelight with her eyes on the tray so she would not spill, and she set it on the table before the gentleman by the window and dropped the small curtsy the landlord's wife required. And only then did she look up. He had already turned from the glass. For a moment, neither of them moved at all. The fire cracked. The rain went on against the window. And in the Earl's face, something happened that had not happened in 10 years, a loosening, a terrible slow recognition, as though a man who had learned to live inside a house with every shutter closed had felt one of them come open in a wind. He said her name, not Nell, the other one. The one no one at the Bell and Anchor had ever heard. She did not answer. She could not. Her body had gone somewhere ahead of her mind, her heart loud in her throat, her hand finding the edge of the table as though the floor had tilted. She had spent 10 years teaching herself that the past was a country with the bridge burned, and here was the past in a black coat, saying the name she had buried, and the name fit her still, like a glove she had told herself she had thrown away. She said the only thing her mouth would give her. She said that he was mistaken. She said she was Nell, that she worked the kitchen, that he wanted the landlord perhaps, and she stepped back toward the door with the empty tray held against her like a shield. He stood. He did not cross to her. He had learned, in 10 years of being the thing rooms drew back from, not to move quickly at anyone. He said her name again instead, low. and he said that he had buried an empty box with her name cut into the stone, and that he had knelt at it every year on the day she was lost, and that he would know her hands in the dark, and that she had a habit when she was frightened of pressing her thumb to the second knuckle of her left hand, and that she was doing it now. She looked down. She was doing it. And that was where the whole of it began to come apart. The careful decade of it, the burned bridge. Because a person can lie with her voice, but the body keeps its own accounts, and hers had just been read aloud by the one man she had believed she would never see again. Let me pull back, because you cannot understand what stood between them in that firelit parlor, without understanding what had put her in that kitchen, and what had kept him in that black coat, and why the two facts were the same fact wearing two coats. 10 years before, Eleanor Vane had married for love, which the world she married into considered a kind of foolishness that only the poor could afford. Marcus had been the nephew of the old Earl of Ravensmere, second in a line he never expected to inherit, and he had met the attorney's daughter at an assembly in a market town and had spent the following spring finding reasons to ride that way. His family had not approved. His aunt, the widow of the old Earl's brother, a woman named Adelia, who had made herself the keeper of the family's consequence the way some women keep the family plate, had told him plainly that a Vane of no fortune was not a match, that there was a daughter of a marquess he was intended for, that a man of his prospects did not throw himself away on a girl who brought nothing to the name but a pretty face and a father who drew up other people's wills. He had married Eleanor anyway. That was the first thing Adelia had never forgiven. The second was worse, and Eleanor did not learn the shape of it for 10 years. They had gone to the Devon coast in their 4th month of marriage, to a house Adelia kept near the cliffs, because Adelia had written a soft letter urging the sea air and the reconciliation of the family. And Eleanor, who wanted the family to love the man she loved, had persuaded a reluctant Marcus to accept. On the 3rd evening there had been a walk along the cliff path at dusk, a walk Adelia had arranged, a servant sent with a message that drew Marcus back to the house, and left Eleanor on the path, alone. And on the path there had been 2 men Eleanor did not know, and a struggle she remembered only in pieces. Cold and salt, and the terrible tilting rush of the fall, and then the water. She had not drowned. She had been meant to. Yet the tide that should have taken her had instead carried her half a mile along the coast, to a shingle cove, where a fisherman's wife found her at dawn more dead than alive, and asked no questions, being a woman who had learned that the sea gave up strange gifts, and that the wise did not inquire too closely into the affairs of the gentry. When Eleanor could speak again, weeks later, she understood 2 things. She understood that someone had wanted her gone, and might want it still, and she understood that the safest dead woman is a dead woman who stays dead. So Eleanor Vane had let the county bury her. She had read, in a paper that reached the fishing village 3 weeks late, that the young wife of Mr. Fore, Marcus Vane, had been lost from the cliffs at Ravensmere's Devon house, that the body had not been recovered, that the family was in deep grief. She had read it in a borrowed kitchen with her hands shaking, and she had understood that to walk back into the light and say, "I am alive," was to walk back toward the 2 men on the path, and toward whoever had sent them. And she did not yet know it was Adelia. She only knew that the world she had married into was a world with teeth, and that a penniless attorney's daughter who cried murder against a great family would be called mad, or worse, and quietly disposed of a second time. The fishing village had no name she ever learned to say with confidence, a scatter of low cottages above a shingle beach, where the men went out before light, and the women mended and salted and asked nothing. The wife who had found her was called Bess, a square, weathered woman with hands harder than Eleanor's would ever grow. And Bess had fed her thin fish broth a spoon at a time for a fortnight before Eleanor could sit up, and had never once asked how a lady in a soaked silk gown had come to be lying in her cove at dawn. When Eleanor tried to thank her, Bess had said only that the sea took, and the sea gave, and that it was not for the likes of them to argue the accounts. Eleanor had learned more from that sentence than from any sermon she had ever sat through in a warm pew. She learned to gut a fish. She learned to carry water. She learned that her soft, educated hands were the one thing about her that could get her noticed, and she worked them raw on purpose, until they looked like anyone's, until the last visible trace of the attorney's daughter was gone. She had not known that the old earl and his only son would both die within 2 years, of a fever that swept the county, and that Marcus, the nephew, would inherit. She had not known that the man she left grieving on a cliff would become the Earl of Ravensmere, and wear black for her for 10 years while the aunt who had tried to kill her arranged his life around the grave. She had known none of it. She had only known how to knead bread and bank a fire and keep her head down, and she had gone up the country by slow stages, from the coast to a market town to a farm to, at last, a coaching inn on the Ravensmere road, never guessing she had circled back within 20 miles of her own headstone. To the girls in the kitchen she was Nell, and Nell was steady, and Nell was kind, and Nell had no history. To the season she would have been nothing at all. The room had decided long ago that a woman in an apron with raw hands was a woman with no story worth the hearing. That was the label the world had fastened to her, and she had worn it because it kept her alive. A label, though, is not a truth. It is only a decision a room has made, and rooms can be made to decide again. In the parlor, the Earl asked her to sit. She did not. He asked her then, more gently than she had heard a gentleman ask anything, whether she was frightened of him, and she found she could not lie to that, and she shook her head, because it was not him she feared. It had never been him. He seemed to understand that. He did not press. He told her in the level voice she would come to know was the voice he used when a thing mattered too much to raise, that he would not speak her name again in that house if it endangered her, that he asked only one thing, that she meet him the following morning, where the old chapel stood empty above the river, where no one went, and tell him what had happened on the cliff. He said he had spent 10 years not knowing. He said a man could bear a grave. He was not sure he could bear the not knowing a day longer. Now that he had seen her carry a bowl of stew across the room, she said she would think on it. She took the tray and went. Her hand, when she reached the passage, was pressed hard to the second knuckle of her left hand, and she did not stop it. That night, she did not sleep. She lay in the narrow bed under the eaves and listened to the rain thin to nothing, and the inn go quiet. And she thought about the shape of the thing she had run from and the shape of the man in the parlor. And she found that grief has a smell, and that she had smelled it on him across a room. The particular staleness of a life, lived entirely indoors with the shutters closed. He had grieved her. Whatever else was true, that was true. Man does not wear black for a decade to deceive a kitchen maid he does not expect to meet. And if he had grieved her, then he had not known. Whoever had sent the men to the cliff, it had not been Marcus. She had never truly believed it was. There is a difference, though, between believing a thing and there is knowing it, and now she knew it, and the knowing undid a knot in her chest she had carried so long she had stopped feeling it as a knot, and had begun to feel it as her own shape. She went to the chapel in the morning. He was already there, standing among the fallen stones with his back to her, and against the gray ruin and the pale river beyond. His black coat was the only dark thing in a world washed to silver by the autumn light. He turned before she spoke. She had the sense that he always would. Now that some part of him had been turned toward her for 10 years, and had only just remembered which way to face, she told him. Standing among the broken stones with a river going by below, she told him about the walk Adelia had arranged, and the message that drew him back to the house and the 2 men on the path in the water. She told him she had not drowned. She told him she had stayed dead because staying dead had seemed the only way to stay alive. She watched his face while she spoke, and she saw the thing she had feared and hoped for in equal measure, which was that he believed her, entirely and at once, as though some part of him had always known that the sea alone had not done it. When she finished, he was quiet a long time. Then he said the name of his aunt. Just the name, Adelia. And in the way he said it, she heard 10 years of a house arranged around a grave, 100 small managements she had not been there to see. And she understood that the woman who had tried to end her had spent the decade since tending the Earl's grief like a garden, keeping it watered, keeping it walled. Because a widower who mourns forever is a widower who will one day, worn down, marry the correct girl she sets before him. He did not rage. That was not his way. She was learning. He grew very still, the way she imagined the sea grew still before it did its worst. He said one thing only. He said that she was not to go back to the inn. She began to protest, out of 10 years of habit, out of the old certainty that safety lay in being no one. And he said it again, level and low. And this time it was not a command that ordered her, but a command that covered her, the way a coat thrown over a shivering person is a kind of order. Come with me. He did not say to what. She found she did not need him to. Here is a thing worth saying. Plainly before the world comes back to the story and makes everything loud. If you have ever been told by the whole weight of a room that you are no one, and have half believed it because believing it was easier than the alternative, then you know what it is to have one person look at you and see the whole of you, and you know it is not a small thing. It is the largest thing. Stay with me. The room is about to be made to look again. She did not go back to the inn as a kitchen maid. Neither, though, did the Earl carry her off in his black coach for the county to gossip over, because he understood, better than she expected, that a woman risen from the dead is a woman in danger until the danger is named and drawn out into the light. So he did the patient thing, the careful thing. He installed her, quietly, with the widow of the old chapel's last vicar, a sharp, kind woman named Mrs. Steen, Poole, who kept her counsel and asked only that Eleanor call her by her name and eat something, for the girl was thin. And he came each day, on foot, in the plain brown coat of a country gentleman rather than the black. And they walked the river path, and slowly, across a fortnight of grey afternoons, the 10 years between them thinned. He told her about the wound she had not been there, for he told it once plainly, standing at the river with his hands behind his back, because he was not a man who could tell a hard thing more than once. He told her that after the cliff he had not been able to enter a church for 2 years, that he had kept a small thing of hers, a bone-handled letter knife her father had given her the day of the wedding, and that he had carried it in his breast pocket every day for 10 years, and that the servants thought it a portrait, and he had never corrected them. He took it out and showed her. The handle was worn pale where his thumb had rubbed it. She had not known she still had anything in the world, and here was a thing of hers, kept warm against a grieving man's heart for a decade, and she had to turn to the river so he would not see her face. That was the anchor between them now, the little knife, though neither of them named it as such. She began to reach for it, without thinking, the way one reaches for a hand. The fortnight taught her. The man in pieces, the way one learns a house, room by room. She learned that he rose before light and rode the eastern boundary of the estate every morning, not from duty, but because motion was the only thing that had ever quieted him. She learned that he read the same 6 books over and over and had not bought a new one in 10 years, as though acquiring anything new had felt, in the grief, like a kind of disloyalty. She learned that he noticed when she had not eaten. Once at the cottage, she had turned her plate away out of the old habit of making herself small, of leaving the good food for others, and he had gone quite still, and then he had said, in the level low voice, that she was to eat, that she had spent 10 years feeding other people, and would now be fed. It was a command. She heard the command. Under the command, she heard the other thing, the thing she was slow to trust, because trusting it meant she was worth the ordering, and she picked up her fork, and she ate, and Mrs. Tace. Poole, watching from the hearth, said nothing at all and smiled into the fire. He never asked her to be Eleanor again all at once. He seemed to understand that a name buried for 10 years could not be dug up like a coin, that it had to be coaxed back into the light a little at a time. He called her Eleanor only when they were alone on the river path, and each time he said it, she felt the syllables settle a fraction more comfortably against her, until by the end of the fortnight the name no longer felt like a glove she had thrown away and found again. It felt like her hand. The body keeps its own accounts, and hers had begun keeping a new one. She was aware of exactly where he stood in any room without looking. When his hand steadied her once at a stile, the warmth of it stayed in her wrist for an hour after. She would catch herself listening for his step on the river path a full quarter-hour before he could possibly arrive. She had spent 10 years making herself small and unnoticing, and now every cent she owned had turned toward one man like a plant toward a window, and she did not have the old habit strong enough to stop it. Nor she found the wish. One afternoon the near touch came and did not complete itself. They had stopped at the ruined chapel out of the wind, and she had been telling him something small, and he had reached, without deciding to tuck back a strand of her hair. The wind had loosed and his hand had come up and stopped, a breath from her cheek, and hung there. Neither of them moved. The whole gray afternoon narrowed to the small warm distance between his fingers and her skin. She could have leaned into his hand. She did not. He could have closed the distance. He did not. They stood at the very edge of the unmakeable thing and did not step over it. And when at last his hand came down without touching her, she felt the not touching more than she had ever felt a touch, and she understood that he was waiting, that he would always wait, that he would let her be the one to arrive. It was Mrs. Poole, plain and kind, who said the word neither of them would. Over tea one evening she looked at Eleanor across the little parlor, and said that a woman could see when a man was in love and grieving both at once, and that it was a hard state to watch, and that if Eleanor meant to send him back to his black coat, she had better do it soon, before the wanting of him became a thing she could not put down. Eleanor did not answer. That night at the small window under Mrs. Poole's eaves, she let herself say it inside her own head, the word she had not permitted herself in 10 years. She wanted him. Not the safety of him, not the rescue of him. Him, and the wanting was not a small, warm thing. It was a flood that had been dammed for a decade, and had just found the crack in the wall. The danger came, as danger does, from the corner they had turned their backs on to look at each other. Adelia was not a fool. A woman who arranges a death and then arranges a decade around it does not fail to notice when her nephew stops coming to dinner in black, when he is seen walking the river path in brown, when a certain kitchen maid vanishes from a certain inn on the very night his coach stopped there. Adelia made inquiries. Adelia was very good at inquiries. And Adelia, when she understood what she was looking at, did not panic, because panic was for people whose position was uncertain, and hers had never been. She did the thing that had always worked. She moved to make the truth impossible to say aloud. She came to Ravensmere unannounced, which she had every right to do, being family, and she brought with her the daughter of a marquess, a cool, composed girl named Lady Sybil, who had been groomed since childhood to be the correct wife, and who wore her grooming like good jewelry. And Adelia announced to the household, and by careful leakage to the county, that the Earl's long mourning was at last to end, that a match had been these many years intended, and that the family would gather at Ravensmere on the coming Thursday to see the Earl restored at last to the living world. She set the whole machinery of consequence in motion. The invitations, the expectations, the weight of 100 watching faces, so that when the Earl balked, as she knew he would be balking not against her, but against the whole visible order of his world. To one of her women, in the private aside of the dressing-room, she named the danger, and named it as she saw it. She said the Earl had taken up with a kitchen slut off the Ravensmere road, and had lost his senses, and that it would be managed as such things were always managed, quietly, before the county could laugh. That was the label spoken the second time, sharper than the world's careless version, spoken by a named enemy in a closed room, and it was spoken not out of mere spite, but out of a certainty, so old it had never once been tested. Word of the gathering reached the river cottage. It reached Eleanor as such things reach the powerless, sideways, through a servant's cousin, and she understood at once what it was. It was a wall being built between her and the light, brick by brick, in the shape of a wedding. She understood that if the Earl refused Lady Sybil publicly, he would be thought mad or bewitched, and that the woman who had bewitched him would be found and named and dealt with, and she understood, with the old cold clarity of 10 years' hiding, that she had brought this down on him by letting herself be seen. She went to him. She found him in the long library at Ravensmere at dusk, among the floor-to-ceiling shelves and the 2 branches of candles, and she told him she would go. She said it steadily. She said she would go north and be Nell again, and he would grieve a little, and then let his aunt have her way, and the county would have its wedding, and he would be safe, and she would be alive, and that these 2 things, his safety and her life, were the only 2 things she had ever wanted, and she could have them both if he would only let her go. He crossed the room. He took her by the shoulders, not hard, and turned her to face him fully in the candlelight, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, and the whole library held its breath around them. Then he said that he had buried her once because he was told to, and that he had spent 10 years learning what that obedience had cost, and that he would not do it again, not for his aunt, not for the county, not to keep her safe, because a life kept safe by burying her a second time was not a life he had any use for. And then he said the other thing, the thing that was not about safety at all. He said that he wanted her, not the girl he had married at 20, her now, with the raw hands and the 10 years and the wariness she wore like a second apron. He said it plainly, the words level, his thumb moving once against the worn place on her shoulder. He said he had grieved a memory for 10 years and had thought that grief was the most he would ever feel again, and that he had been wrong, that the woman in front of him was more than the memory had ever been, and that he did not want to be careful about it any longer. She kissed him. Or he kissed her. Neither of them could afterward have said which, only that the distance they had held at the ruined chapel finally closed, and that it was soft and full of the 10 years, and that when it ended, they stood with their foreheads together in the candlelight and breathed. She had thought the wanting would frighten her. It did not. It felt like coming in out of a rain. She had been standing in so long she had forgotten it was rain. Then she stepped back. Because she was not a girl who mistook a kiss for a victory, and the wall was still being built, and Thursday was coming. She did not run this time. That was the whole of what had changed in her. For 10 years her answer to danger had been to disappear, and now standing in the library with the taste of him still on her mouth, she found she was done disappearing. She would not save him by vanishing. She would save them both by doing the one thing she had never dared, which was to walk into the room the world had built to bury her, and stand up in it, and be seen. She told him her plan. He listened, and where another man might have refused to let her risk it, he understood that to refuse her, the risk was to make himself one more person who managed her life for her, and he had spent a decade being managed and had no wish to inflict it. He said only that he would be beside her. She said she was counting on it. Thursday came gray and bright. Ravensmere filled with the county, the drawing rooms and the long gallery bright with candles, though it was scarcely dark. The family assembled. Adelia in grey silk and old diamonds arranged at the head of it all, with Lady Sybil composed and lovely at her hand. The Earl came down in black, which set a murmur going, for the county had been promised the end of his mourning. And here he was in it still. Adelia's fan paused a half-inch in its motion, the only sign she gave, and then went on. She was certain. She had always been certain. She had a Marquess's daughter, and 100 witnesses, and a decade of careful walls, and she believed, as she had always believed, that a room does what the person who owns the room decides it will do. The Earl asked leave to say a word before the evening began. Adelia gave it graciously, because to refuse would have been strange, and because she believed she knew what he would say, that he would announce the match, or fumble and be led to announce it, and that either way the machinery would carry him. He did not announce the match. He said in the level-carrying voice of a man who owns the room he stands in, that 10 years before he had buried an empty box, and that he had recently learned the box had always been empty, and that his wife, whom the family had grieved as drowned, was alive, and that he intended to say so before the county so that no one could ever again say it quietly for him. And he turned toward the gallery door, and Eleanor came through it. She had not tried to look like a lady. That was the thing that undid the room. She wore a plain gray gown, Mrs. Poole had found her, and her hair simply done, and her hands were the raw hands of a woman who worked, and she walked into the bright hall exactly as she was, a kitchen maid off the Ravensmere Road, and she stopped beside the Earl and did not curtsy to the assembly, and the whole bright room went silent as a held breath. Adelia stood. Her certainty carried her upright out of long habit, and she said, into the silence, that this was madness, that the woman was an impostor, a kitchen slut, trading on a dead lady's name, and that the Earl had plainly lost his reason to grief. That was the label spoken the third time, in the great public arena, before the whole assembled county, and it was the last time it would ever be spoken, though Adelia did not know that yet. Eleanor did not flinch. She had spent 10 years learning to be silent, and had chosen at last the one room in which to speak. She looked at Adelia across the bright hall, and she said quietly enough that the room had to still further to hear her, that she had a scar on her left shoulder from a garden wall she had climbed as a girl, that the Earl knew of it, that her father's letter knife with the bone handle had been in the Earl's breast pocket for 10 years and had been given her on her wedding day, and that Adelia had sent the message on the cliff path that drew the Earl back to the house and left her alone with the 2 men who put her in the sea. The room did not gasp. It was past gasping. It had gone into the deep stillness a crowd falls into when it is watching something be decided, and in that stillness the Earl reached into his breast pocket and drew out the bone-handled knife and held it up in the candlelight so the county could see the worn pale place where his thumb had rubbed it for 10 years, and he set it in Eleanor's raw hand and closed her fingers over it. And that was the whole of his declaration, done without a speech. He said 8 words. He said that this was his wife, and he was glad. The knife lay in her closed hand. The candlelight moved on it. And the room, which had been Adelia's room, which had for a decade done what Adelia decided it would do, quietly, and all at once stopped being hers. It was that 100 faces turned from the woman in gray silk to the woman in the plain gray gown. And, in turning, decided. An old man near the front, a magistrate who had known the family 40 years, said into the quiet that he remembered the drowning and had never liked the smell of it. A woman who had been at the wedding 10 years before said, lo, that she would know Eleanor Vane anywhere, that she had the very look of her father. The recognition moved through the room the way warmth moves through a cold house. Slow and then everywhere. Adelia stood a moment longer in the wreck of her certainty. She was not a stupid woman, and she saw in the turning of the 100 faces that the room had been taken from her, and would not be given back, and that to say another word would be to hand the county the sight of her fighting for a thing already lost. Her fan came down, her mouth opened once, and closed. And then, because she had always understood consequence better than anyone in the room, she gathered the ruin of her dignity, and did the only thing left that would not make it worse, which was to say, in a voice gone thin, that she had clearly been misinformed, and to turn and to go with Lady Sybil, who had never wanted any of it, following pale and relieved behind her. There was no need to break her further. The room had done it. The truth had done it. She was not destroyed. She was only at last displaced. Later, when the county had gone and the candles had burned low, the solicitor who had come with the family, a dry, careful man named Mr. Bray, Hartwell confirmed to the Earl in the empty library what the Earl already knew, that a living wife once acknowledged before witnesses of standing could not be unacknowledged by anyone, aunt or marquess or magistrate, and that the matter was, in the law's cold, comfortable language, settled. Eleanor stood at the window with the bone knife in her hand, and listened to her own restoration, read out in legal terms, and found that it meant less to her than the fact of the man crossing the room to stand beside her at the glass. They did not go back into the bright hall. They stayed in the quiet library, and he stood beside her at the tall window, and outside the first snow of the year had begun to fall on the Ravensmere grounds, thick and slow and silent, settling on the gray stone and the bare beeches and the black coach still standing in the drive that neither of them would need again. She thought of the 10 years. She thought of the narrow bed under the eaves at the inn, and the raw work of her hands and the name she had buried to stay alive, and she found she did not resent a day of it because it had made her into the woman who could walk into that bright hall and stand up in it. And the girl of 20 could never have done that. The girl of 20 had needed rescuing. The woman of 30 had rescued herself and had only needed him to hold the door. He asked her, quietly watching the snow, whether she would like to see the rooms that had been made ready for a wife 10 years ago and never used. She said not yet. She said she would like first to sit by the fire a while, in the warm, with the snow coming down, and do nothing at all, because she had not done nothing in 10 years and had begun to think she had earned an hour of it. He almost smiled. It was not quite a smile. It was the thing a face does on the way to remembering how, and she thought she would like to be there for the rest of the remembering. They sat by the fire. The snow came down. On the small table between them, the Earl had set the bone-handled letter knife, and the firelight moved on the worn, pale place where his thumb had rubbed it for 10 years. And Eleanor reached out, once, and touched it, and left her hand there, and did not press her thumb to the second knuckle of her left hand, because she was not frightened any longer, and would not need to be. Again, if Eleanor's 10 years of silence moved you, stay a moment in the quiet with her before you go. Thank you for staying to the end. The fire was warm, the snow was falling, and the black coat, at last, was hung away.